77th session of the United Nations General Assembly has begun. As Jaishankar, the Indian External Affairs Minister, would be representing India, Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Chinese President Xi Jinping, and the Russian President Vladimir Putin would not be attending in person. The theme of the meeting is Watershed Moment, Transformative Solutions to Interlocking Challenges. Ambassador Wadhwa, this session is taking place at quite a challenging moment. The specter of war is hanging in Europe, and the consequent crises like energy and the food are being faced by many countries. How do you think the session would be significant in the near future?
So obviously, dominant theme would be the war in Europe, particularly in Ukraine, and the consequent fallout of this conflict in the rest of the world. Most of the countries in Europe would be using this occasion at the United Nations General Assembly to bring out the issues regarding what they call aggression of Russia vis-a-vis Ukraine, and the rest of the world, of course, is more concerned about more existential issues and the fallout of this conflict. Now, as you know, that the world is not free of other conflicts, but the main issue of the aggression of China, for example, in the South China Sea, on the Indo-Chinese border, and incursions in the Western Pacific, etc., are at the back of minds of people. The Taiwan crisis is also at the back of minds of countries, but at the same time will be on the back burner because of the burning issues in Ukraine. And a recurring theme, of course, is the transformation which is taking place in the world because of technological changes, and how the world is going to cope with that. The UNGA president has also given a call for the UNGA to tackle these issues, talk about them, and at the same time he has given priority to UN reform, which makes a very interesting agenda for the 77th UNGA.
Ambassador Wadhwa, Prime Minister Narendra Modi in the past had given 5 S for the World Forum at the United Nations. Samman, Samvad, Sahyog, Shanti, Samriddhi. These 5 S's encompassed the whole philosophy of the Indian Prime Minister in his approach to number of world issues. And when he met the Russian President Vladimir Putin on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, he reiterated the peace aspirations of the world, that the era is no more of war, which has in fact, Ambassador Wadhwa, been stressed by the French president in his address at the UNGA. So how do you think that the 5 S's, the Prime Minister, would be relevant in the current session?
So obviously, India has been pushing for peace and prosperity in the world, and the 5 S's were spelled out in detail earlier with this in mind. Also, the fact that the world is very globalized in today's context, and therefore, unless there is cooperation and coordination amongst all countries of the world, especially at the United Nations, these problems that are facing the world today will be very difficult to solve. And the fact that the Prime Minister mentioned the fact that today is not the time for war is a factual comment. I think the French President and perhaps others from the Western world will also use this in order to browbeat the Russian president, and also to say that even countries like India, for example, which are closely aligned with Russia, do not support this war in Ukraine. So that is to be expected, of course. What the Prime Minister said was in the context of the fact that there are too many problems which are facing the world, and that problems should be concentrated upon rather than trying to solve issues through conflict. So I presume this is something which will be understood by most countries, but of course the statement can be used by many in a different context, as has been done already by the French president.
Ambassador Wadhwa, EM Jaishankar would be addressing the UNGA on 24th. And the immediate concerns for India indeed would be countering terrorism. At the same time, we have taken the agenda of reform of the multilateral bodies equally. Besides, climate action is equally a great and grave concern for a number of countries, including India. And also the equitable access to critical pandemic interventions like vaccines and medicines. In countering terrorism, we have seen that China has blocked the designation of a number of terrorists at the UN Forum. So do you think that the United Nations hasn't lived up to the expectations in countering terrorism?
Well, as we know that India has been tabling this resolution on terrorism since 1996 at the UNGA. It enjoys wide widespread support, but there is no conformity or there is no consensus on the definition of terrorism even today. Obviously, those who are not interested in finding common text are finding that as an excuse, and this state of affairs will continue most likely at this forthcoming UNGA as well. That doesn't stop countries like India from articulating the concerns. In fact, the threat of terrorism is now felt across the globe. Most countries who were left untouched earlier are also facing the brunt of terrorism, and many countries have come together now to bring about a coalition, so to speak, of countries in order to counter terrorist influences, especially cross-border terrorism, which is India's main concern. On the reform of the multilateral system, the climate change action, and also the equitable allocation of resources for pandemic intervention, these are, of course, ongoing themes which have been important for many countries for the past many years. I guess there is a lot of momentum nowadays on climate action because not much has been achieved. Many countries who are taking some action have been stopped dead in their tracks because of lack of finances and also because of the global situation and the fallout of the Ukraine war, for instance, which has pushed up energy prices, which has created a food insecurity in many countries, especially in Asia and in Africa, and at the same time has brought about difference in attitude towards fossil fuels and how to reduce them and in what time frame, etc. On the issue of China, I think the China-Pakistan nexus is now quite well known and established, and China does not want to act in any manner which harms its all-weather ally Pakistan. The technical hold that it puts repeatedly on known terrorist offenders is testimony to that. I presume that this action will continue at this UNGA, and perhaps after a while, once Pakistan is satisfied or goes ahead, gives a green signal, then the Chinese will lift that ban. This is a repeated pattern which has been happening. And countries like these need to be called out, which many countries have started to do now. Of course, India has taken the lead in the past, but this was actually a joint proposal by the United States and by India against a mastermind who actually masterminded terrorist attacks in India. And therefore, it is not at all explicable that the Chinese still insist on technical holds while there is widespread evidence against the offender. We always keep saying in the UNGA and otherwise bilateral meetings with other countries that one day this will come back to bite the Chinese themselves. If terrorism raises its head in Xinjiang or in other parts of China, it will then realize that it's making a big mistake by not supporting repeated offenders of terrorism and getting blindsided by what the Pakistanis have to tell the Chinese.
Indeed, Ambassador Wadhwa, one interesting aspect is that while we have been stressing on the expansion of the Security Council of the United Nations, which essentially reflect the Second World War, immediate years of the Second World War, post-war era. And a lot of waters have flown in the rivers, and still we find that the countries are still blocking the efforts to expand the Security Council. Do you think that the United Nations really represent the today's world in democratic manner?
So the world has changed drastically since after the Second World War, when the United Nations system was formed. At that point in time, it was largely the countries who ended up on the victorious side. And also at that point in time, there were certain countries with a much higher GDP. But today we have a number of countries which have overtaken them. India, for example, has overtaken the United Kingdom. India contributes a lot to the United Nations peacekeeping operations. It is probably going to become the world's largest populous state. Already it is a population of 1.4 billion people, representing more than 1/6 of humanity. It is a major player and has a major voice in all finding solutions to the major problems in the world today. And without countries like India, the other G4 countries like Japan, Germany or Brazil, the United Nations Security Council lacks the representation that it should in today's context. On the other hand, certain countries who do not deserve to be there are still hanging on to their positions in the United Nations Security Council. India is not saying they should not be there, but India is saying that the Security Council should be expanded to include legitimately those who actually deserve to be there. It's only then that it will be able to solve the major problems which confront the world. And by all accounts, India's qualifications are right up there as far as the membership of the UN Security Council is concerned.
Thank you, Ambassador Wadhwa, for sharing your insight with us.
Thank you very much.